You're listening to Weird Realities, the destination of choice for those inquisitive minds seeking to find that special place where myth, science, history, and folklore intersect. Where we interview authors, podcasters, content creators, and filmmakers to discuss their work and projects, as well as dive deep into the weird things that capture our imaginations and stimulate our minds. Weird Realities is a Night Callers production made possible by Lauren Smith, producer, with audio and visual by Beaverhook Productions.
Who's asleep amidst the trees? Bats all the swaying in the breeze. But one soul lies anxious, wide awake, fearing all manner of ghouls, hags, and wraiths.
Welcome to Weird Inc. Session 8. I'm your host, Hadley Thorne, author of the Tapestry of World series, and today I'm joined by the newest member to the Weird Realities crew, Mr. Shay Tully.
Hey everybody, thanks for having me again. Let's welcome author Jay Cutchins to the show. How you doing, Jay? Joshua?
I'll answer to anything. It's all it's all good. I'm doing well. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm really looking forward to talking.
Excellent. So in addition to being a published composer and accomplished jazz and rock tuba player, wow, that's fun. Today's guest is a scholar holding a master's degree in both music, literature, and journalism. Joshua has written extensively on Bigfoot, multi-dimensional beings, UFOs, fairy, and witch lore in his books. And there's a very long line of books here. Let's see, we've got A Trojan Feast, the food and drink offerings of aliens, fairies, and Sasquatch. The Brimstone Deceit, an in-depth examination of supernatural scents, that's hard to say, otherworldly odors, and monstrous miasmas. Thieves in the Night, a brief history of supernatural child abductions, and Where the Footprints End, High Strangeness, and the Bigfoot Phenomenon, volumes 1 and 2, with Timothy Renner. And he's also a contributor to Robbie Graham's collection of ufological, it's hard to say also, essays, UFOs, Reframing the Debate, as well as David Weatherly's Sasquatch collection, Wood Knocks, volume 3. Excerpts from his work have appeared in 14 times in Edge Science, 14 times, not 14. Is that 14 or 14?
Yeah, Fortean after
Fortean.
Charles Fort. Yeah.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Oh, you're good.
He's also been featured in the hit History Channel television show Ancient Aliens, and a recurring roundtable guest on Where Did the Road Go podcast. That was rambling, and I apologize.
No,
Well,
you're
welcome,
good.
Joshua, and let me say it's a pleasure to have you here. I've already mentioned I'm a huge fan of your work. And as I blend folklore, myth, and legend into my series and have studied on these topics for years, I'm super curious as to what spurred your interest into the Fae realm and Bigfoot, and to find out how you made the connection and all between fairy lore and alien abductions.
Oh boy. Well, I sort of started off as a monster kid, right? Like, anything that was a creature feature or, monster movie, I'd be all about that. I think the first film that I ever saw was the old 1933 King Kong. And I was just always into, monster movies and stuff. So I always had interest in stuff like Bigfoot. As far as why the fairy thing really tickled my fancy, I kind of feel like it found me more than I found it. And I really can't pinpoint anything specifically as to why that is. I do know that for whatever reason, I had always logged in the back of my mind that there was this folklore about it being dangerous to accept food in fairyland, because that used to be my thing. My wife used to be like, "Why are you listening to all these paranormal podcasts?" And I used to say, "Well, if I'm ever held captive by a leprechaun, I know what to do and you don't." So but it always sort of had that in the back of my head, and I had sort of a passing interest in this, and was at some point, again, I can't tell you when, but I was aware of the fact that Jacques Vallée ufologist, had brought up a lot of parallels between UFOs and this old fairy lore. And for whatever reason, this sort of alluded to this while we were talking before we started rolling here. It gave me a back door into a lot of these subjects that I ended up appreciating because, I always had a lot of problems with the idea of UFOs, just from a basic logical standpoint that I think a lot of people resonate with. Why do these entities have technology that seems like it's at best a couple of years ahead of us, or in terms of the way that they supposedly are collecting DNA, several years behind us. I can go give my DNA with a mouth swab right now. I don't need a drill cord into my head. So there are a lot of inconsistencies, a lot of incongruities like that, and I feel like the fairy lore was a way of me sort of seeing how this is an expression of a lot of these older myth themes and a lot of these older archetypes manifesting time and again. What I really think is cool about that, I do think that there is something genuinely anomalous going on, and I like to think that it's a non-human intelligence that we're interacting with. But having said that, I just find it so fascinating that regardless of whether these things exist or not, the same motifs keep on coming up, the same stories keep on coming up, and they always get recontextualized, but there really is nothing new under the sun.
Exactly.
And
it's so interesting.
And so I think that says something to me that implies one of several things. It implies that there really is something to this idea that Carl Jung had, that we all have a collective unconscious, which is wild if that's the case. Or it implies that our cultures have been sharing a lot of these themes for a lot longer than they were supposed to, because you'll find stuff from European myth that is a one-to-one direct comparison to something that you'll find in Algonquin myth or something. so either there's this collective unconscious, or we as a globe were exchanging stories a lot earlier than we ever thought, or my favorite, there is an objective reality to some of these things, and these are independent observations that all these different cultures have made just by interacting with the other. And I find any one of those three things really fascinating. Even the most boring, quote unquote boring one, is that we all are sort of wired to imagine the same way, which I still find absolutely fascinating too. So, but yeah, and the thing with the fairy stuff is that I really do believe, having sat with it and sort of lived with it for a while, that it's the most robust, flexible, applicable body of belief in terms of describing the supernatural, in terms of describing the paranormal. And part of that's because that was the only way people had to describe things, right? They just sort of called everything fairies the way we call everything paranormal or supernatural. But at the same time, there are these motifs that keep on coming up. Missing time, this food taboo that I mentioned, some of the smells in some of my books that I looked at, even things that are really specific, like, the braiding of horses' manes. You'll find that in witch folklore. You'll find that in Bigfoot folklore nowadays. You'll find that in fairy folklore. You see these patterns coming up time and time and time again, and 9 times out of 10, they're rooted in this fairy folklore, which is, heck, even the idea of fairies themselves, the fact that every single culture around the world has this concept of these short human-like beings who typically live underground, who love to kidnap people and kidnap children. The idea that idea would sort of manifest itself independently across these different cultures is either fascinating or points to the fact that we're not the only tenants in the building, so to speak.
Well, speaking of that, Iceland, they have a lot of respect for the elves that live in Iceland and will move entire roads rather than disturb one of their so-called homes.
Yeah, I think that the belief has waned a little bit since I found the statistic, but I remember back in around 2015, I found a stat from like the 90s that was like 50% of Icelandic people or something,
Yeah.
believe that there's something to these myths. And, even in my the one time that I was able to go to Ireland, I talked to a lot of people, and there were plenty of folks that I talked to about sort of fairy folklore, and they'd say things like, "Well, I don't believe in fairies, but I'm terrified of them." Yeah, so it was the sort of thing where you don't you don't dwell on it, and you don't like rearrange your life, but you're sure as heck not going to be found in the fairy fort at 2 a.m. and you're sure as heck not going to cut down that single tree sitting in the middle of the field, because it's probably not going to happen to you. But what if you do that and your life goes astray? Because some of the stories that people tell are everything from blinded to paralyzed to being outright killed for interfering with fairy business.
Well, I have total respect for the Fae folk. Total respect. That's one of the things. And I'm just going to jump around to my notes because, like I said, I'm all over your stuff. So, talking about gifting, and I believe in gifting to the forest spirits or elementals or the Fae folk, whatever your term of choice is for them. But I also found it interesting that y'all made a lot of parallels with that with Bigfoot. And I thought that was really interesting, and I'd love to hear what you found about that.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's this long-standing tradition of trying to offer something, usually something consumable like food or drink or tobacco, or something non-consumable like coins. But there's this long-standing tradition of offering things from our world to the other world. So offering things to your ancestors, offering things to genus loci, spirits of place, like you alluded to, gods, etc. But I think it was really Timothy who sort of explored a lot of this stuff with the Bigfoot gifting, because people indeed do this, and some of the stuff that you see is really compelling. You'll find I'm a Southern boy, so I know that raccoons are a lot smarter than we give credit for. But some of the stuff that people will leave out, certain containers that would require opposable thumbs and strength to get to, and they get to these foodstuffs, where people will leave out food in other different scenarios that is taken when they come back and see it. For example, you might leave out an apple, and then when you come back, as part of the gifting thing, you might find a pebble with a leaf underneath it or something. So just things that imply that there's some sort of intelligence on the other end of that exchange. One of my favorite examples that I found was these people who were believed to be involved with gifting with Bigfoot, and they received, after leaving out some food, they received this little package of woven grass with mouse bodies in it. And it's
wow.
like, yeah, I don't know what did that, but I'm pretty sure a raccoon didn't weave this little sushi package of mice together, right? So there's that, but there's also these stories, because these typically come from people who are Bigfoot habituators, and I have a lot of reason, like a lot of people do, to be sort of skeptical of these stories, because if you have Bigfoot on your property, then by God, why can't you give us a good picture? But at the same time, I understand that there may be things about these phenomena that sort of preclude good pictures being taken. But it's the exact same things that you'll hear in terms of the way that these relationships play out, as you would among, forest spirits, even your ancestors, if you had an ancestor altar in some cultures, or the Fae folk. There's an example that I talked about, and I think Timothy repeated it again in Volume 1 of Where the Footprints End, where this, I think this is from Sasquatch Chronicles. There's this guy whose grandfather had a heart attack, but his grandfather had been sort of gifting Bigfoot on the farm while the grandson was in Kuwait, and during the first Persian Gulf War, and the grandson came back and found that all the livestock had been slaughtered, because the gifting had ceased in the interim when the grandfather was in the hospital. And you find similar stories about, if you didn't leave out food or drink, for the Fae folk, you would have any number of horrible things happen. In fact, there's actually a story from one of the Scottish Isles where there was a brownie who basically did the exact same thing and ended up slaughtering all the livestock because someone hadn't left out the right amount of food and drink for them while they were gone. So it's almost the exact same story. takes on a little bit of an additional dimension when you think about the fact that, a lot of these brownies and a lot of the brownie analogs that you'll find in Western Europe, Picamberlin, goblins, sort of the French variant. A lot of these sort of brownie variants that you'll find in Europe were like these, granted they were short, but they were, monkey face, sort of hairy creatures, what we categorize as something like a Littlefoot nowadays, So yeah, I don't know what to make of that. Some people are like, do you think Bigfoot's a fairy? And I'm like, well, I think Bigfoot has a lot to do with that same body of observations for sure.
Like I said, I think, first off, my personal opinion is that people use Bigfoot to cover a lot of stuff that we don't know about.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And it's just easy for them to think that it's a smart ape. And I don't necessarily think I have enough information to make that decision. Oftentimes the people I've listened to talk about their experiences, they don't see anything. They'll they'll know something's there. They'll have a smell like you've covered, but you don't really see it. It's just
it sort of reminds me of whenever you see like something strange on your news, and the first thing people go to is like, oh, is it aliens? Somebody finds a weird footprint, or there's something where it's like, remember the monuments that kept on popping up all over the country last year? These just these metal everybody's like, oh, is it aliens? Like, that's the first thing that people jump to. And I'm like, man, there's a lot of weird stuff out there. You don't always have to jump to aliens. So yeah, people experience things, and it's always context dependent, right? So my friend Soraya Ascath, Where Did the Road Go, said a long time ago, he said, you see this best in terms of the light phenomena. If you see a light on Ben Bulben in Ireland, oh, it's fairy lights. If you see a light in an old house, so it's a haunted house and it's a ghost. If you see a light in the sky, it's a Bigfoot. So you really need to sort of break down what people are experiencing and say, how much of this is actually what they're experiencing, and how much of this is a conclusion that's being drawn because of the setting. And
how much of this is Elon Musk just messing with us.
Right. And honestly too, I mean, how much of this is people hoaxing and lying. I think that's a significantly less portion than we estimate, but yeah, that too. So it occurred to me a little while back that a lot of these things that people attribute to Bigfoot, unless you see a giant hairy man beast in front of you, you can't necessarily say it was Bigfoot. There are certain things that are associated with Bigfoot and that happen around Bigfoot sightings and happen in areas that have Bigfoot sightings, but unless you see Bigfoot, knocking on a tree with a stick, you can't say that knock that you heard in the forest was Bigfoot doing it. And that's when it occurred to me that, it's sort of the same suite of things that if you put it inside a house would be poltergeist phenomena, right? Thrown stones, weird smells, weird voices, raps and knocks on heard in the forest. Even footprints and handprints, those are all poltergeist things too. But people say, oh, well, I'm in the woods, so it must be Bigfoot. But we really don't know. Not that Bigfoot isn't seen throwing rocks, and Bigfoot, there are very few cases where I think Bigfoot's been seen knocking a tree, but let's say that there has been. At the same time, you can't say that it's definitely Bigfoot if these things happen, because unless you see, the big guy doing it. So
it's all in where the context lies.
Yeah, 100. Yeah, exactly. It's a good way to put it.
Well, and what you grow up with, I think, our generation. Well, I say our generation. I think Gen Xers are really. We grew up with Bigfoot, so I think that's why so many of us are very interested in that. And cryptids and things like that, because that was big when we were growing up. I'm not sure so much, like, I remember, and I'm a Southern girl, and my grandmother grew up in Alabama, and I remember her, which was an older grandmother, not a younger one, but I can remember her talking about that old wild man, and she would say, you don't go out to the forest after dark. And it was never anything like it was just like a knowing. and she just talked about it in passing like it was something we should know about. And I was always very curious about what is she talking about. And I found later, like just listening to some of the Bigfoot researchers talk that were older, that they grew up with their grandmothers, and that was what they referred to Bigfoot as, was because Bigfoot wasn't Bigfoot yet. Patty hadn't been filmed. It was the old wild man in the forest.
Yeah, I mean, do you ever hear the term booger that ever get thrown around?
Oh yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
the booger man.
Well, and that's one of those things that I always like to sort of trot out is like, the booger man comes from boogeyman, and boogeyman comes from, bogarts and boggles and all these sort of, nursery boggles is what you call them in fairy lore. But fairies, this is all, it all really comes back around to that stuff. But yeah, and here's the thing that people sort of misinterpret is that when I compare stuff to a lot of this fairy lore, they're like, oh, you think that, extraterrestrials are actually fairies, or you think the fairies are extraterrestrials, or you think that Bigfoot's a fairy, or vice. I don't think that any of it's accurate, right?
Exactly. I know.
I don't think that anybody has a monopoly on what these things actually are. I think that they are describing the same thing and trying to describe the same thing. But as far as like one model of what this is having supremacy, I think the truth's probably somewhere in between.
It's all roads lead to Rome kind of thing. It's many different paths to the same story. There's no telling what each one is verbatim. You can't decide, well, yes, this is Bigfoot, this is fairy, this is alien, this is an angel, this is whatever, because there's no physical proof that you can find in every situation. But we all know it's all connected somehow.
Yeah,
so
no, exactly.
Like all roads lead to Rome. So we know it's something different than, John at the corner, on a crack binge, but I mean, we know it's something that's I don't want to say extraterrestrial, extra dimensional, whatever. We know it's something that isn't of the norm. Is it?
I mean, yeah, that's the thing. I've talked to some people who, so that was really well stated. I've talked to some people who have, sort of gone in the direction of, yes, it's the dead extraterrestrial fairy ghosts, and like I kind of, but because if you go through this stuff long enough and you look at enough of it, it really does just have this feeling that it all really is that all roads lead to Rome thing that you were pointing out. Everything leads to this otherness that has been trying to contact us. I
like that otherness. That's good.
I feel like I am a Christian. It's really difficult to reconcile sometimes, and it's difficult to navigate sometimes for me. But I do feel like, in that sense of everything sort of pointing towards this other reality that we find ourselves enmeshed in, sometimes I feel like I'm writing about my faith when I'm writing about the UFO experience, and I'm writing about the even the Bigfoot experience, because the same modes of interaction have been there time and again. And that's where I kind of have some sympathy for a lot of the extraterrestrial, or rather ancient aliens folks, who were saying, look, Ezekiel's wheel is a UFO. I'm like, well, you're kind of halfway right, because I think that Ezekiel's wheel is the same phenomena that we've associated with UFO, but you've got to take away all that baggage that we have about little green men and just realize that it's just one of the modalities through which this other intelligence that seems really obsessed with us is trying to communicate with us. And, I think that's a healthier way to look at it, a more agnostic way to look at it.
I agree. I like that. Like I said, Joshua, I really like the way that you've approached this, and I find it meshes very, very much with how I believe. And I'm so glad that you can say it so eloquently. It's just great.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. I stumble over myself more than I want to, so I appreciate that.
Well, it's hard. It's a hard subject because so many people have their opinions about it, and they don't think there's any room for wiggle, So it's a tough. I know, just because I'm on the outer circle of the Bigfoot community because of my relationship with our producer, and she it produces the show, and she's been in the Bigfoot community since 2009 running a podcast. And there's not a lot. I mean, it's very black or white. There's not a lot of room for, well, I'm not sure what I think about that. And she recently did a interview with Ron Moorhead, and a lot of people in her community didn't want to support her decision to have that interview done. And I'm like fascinated by Mr. Moorhead, and just bought his book about quantum Bigfoot, and I'm really interested in learning more about what he's experienced. And like I said, there's so much we don't understand. I think that we have to have an open mind and ask the questions.
I mean, yeah, that is one of the things that really drives me up an absolute wall is how quickly we like to, shore up our defenses and make our own little tribes. I mean, that's the problem with, not to sound like an old man here, but that's the problem with the country today, right? I mean, it's this us versus them. Oh no, I have a monopoly on being reasonable. I have a monopoly on the way that the world works. And I think it shouldn't be in any part of your life. Well, not any part of your life, but you should always question your own belief system, question your own BS, as Robert Anton Wilson would have said. But also, I mean, especially in the paranormal, I mean, we're all living in glass houses here. The fact that the ghost people think that the Bigfoot people are crazy, and the fact that the UFO people think the ghost people are crazy, it's just so darn silly. Because
when I was learning how to do shamanic journeying, and I've always, like I said, always had a fascination for Bigfoot, but it did not. They were not subjects that touched. And I went to lunch with a friend of mine who, I think I mentioned, she's in mental health, and she's got a PhD in mental health, and she's also a student of shamanism. We've taken classes together, and we were talking about people talking about Bigfoot's using portals. And she looked at me with this sly smile, and she said, "But we journey through a tree when we go on a shamanic journey." And I just sat there and stared at her, and I was like, oh my gosh, that's so true, because it's an altered state. And that's going to lead me to asking about the smells, because that was another thing I found so fascinating, was you talking about how certain smells can trigger altered states of consciousness.
Yeah, it's interesting. That's well, the tree thing I find really fascinating. Before we go on that altered states of consciousness idea, like, there's something about trees, man. I mean, I don't know what it is, but
and I'll tell you what she told me, because she's into the earth grids and very open and incredibly interesting. But she's like, tree roots, they all touch. It's a web. It's like the internet, but it's trees and it's in the earth.
I mean, yeah, it reminds me of what some people talk about. Some of the fact that the mushrooms are all connected. They have networks of interconnecting tissue as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't know what to make of it, but there's something about trees that sits at the center of this. There's something about mushrooms that sits at the center of this. And as I know you mentioned Ron Moorhead, and I think he talked about the woodnox not being a monkey hitting a tree with a stick, but it's like literally these spirits going in and out of trees. And
that gives me chills.
Well, it sounds silly until you think about the number of spirits that have been associated with trees, and you think about the fact. I mean, even this is something I'm working on my next book right now. I found really fascinating is that there's a strand of Judaism. Some rabbis talked about trees being repositories for unsaved souls and stuff. So,
oh wow,
this is just like weird. I mean, yeah, if you dig back in some, that's part of the reason that I kind of feel sometimes that I'm writing about my faith when I write about all this other weird stuff, is because if you go back far enough, like, Judaism is kind of this weird star religion, actually. If you go back way far enough, there's a great book called a guy named Schwartz named Tree of Souls, and it's like Jewish. I say mythology not in a disparaging way, but just as a way of talking about an older set of beliefs, and it's some fascinating stuff in there. One of the things is that trees were like, sort of had this connection to souls and almost sort of have a soul themselves. So it's wild.
In Norse myth, you have the world tree, and it is the tree that connects the 9 worlds.
Yep, and that's a really common Indo-European motif too that you see all the time. And then and that's the thing, is you start talking about this, and I think if you're doing it right, you don't end up talking about dermal ridges. You don't end up talking about anti-gravity propulsion systems. Like, you end up talking about this giant symbolic soup that we live our lives in. Like, that's where I think the meat of the conversation is. It's not in like what planet the aliens come from or how they're able to accelerate so quickly in terms of crunching numbers. I think it's really about taking a look at how these symbols and these myth themes just keep on echoing across time. 100%. Yeah. So
one of
altered
the things
states
that people don't seem to be talking about with the aliens is them and this is with the Tic Tac alien stuff that recently came out with the Navy, is they're going into the water. They're going, into the earth, so to speak. And that's even more fascinating to me.
Well, and you look at, you've got a bunch of people who are really interested in these the Nimitz videos and whatnot, but they're always approaching it from an extraterrestrial angle. And even though I don't think what we're looking at represents a strictly physical craft, I have to sort of be specific when I say that, because I think these things are physical and non-physical in a way that we really haven't wrapped our heads around yet. But like, you don't have people talking about as much, the ultra-terrestrial idea, or the idea, there's a great book by Ivan Sanderson, Invisible Resonance, that was talking about the possibility of there being civilizations on the seafloor. You don't hear people talking about that, which I think is, just as interesting a possibility and just as plausible a possibility as outer space. And then, if you're looking at this mythological soup that we're looking at too, at the bottom of the sea was one of the locations of fairyland. At the bottom of the ocean was where a lot of cultures place the afterlife. I mean, there's some evidence to suggest that the word soul actually has some Old English roots in the same word for sea. And again, I think that people ignore that sort of thing at their own peril. But yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to completely derail you. You asked me the altered states question, and I completely.
I'm fascinated. I'm interested to see what Shay thinks, because, like I said, I'm very interested in all this, and I know he has a totally different take than I do.
Well, I can't talk on altered states. My altered state normally involved mushrooms in a field somewhere. So.
No, I mean but that's exactly it. I mean, I think that if you, because we talked about mushrooms being part of this, and I'm definitely part of the sector of UFO interest, ufology, that I would be interested to see an experiment done not with telescopes but with mushrooms. Like, let's have a group of people consume mushrooms, and let's have a control group sitting there observing them, and let's see what if they see anything that's happening to this control group. I talked to somebody who was a friend of mine, who she and her boyfriend I guess, had actually taken some mushrooms together, and they the boyfriend went inside while she was out in the garden, and she remembers this light in the sky just shining this beam of light down on her, and she was freaking out because she's like, this is a UFO. Like, what the heck is happening? I'm having a weird trip where this UFO is coming. And the husband runs back out to the garden, and he's like, are you okay? Because I just saw this bright light shining down on you from the sky. So that's not the way that quote unquote hallucinations are supposed to work. They're supposed to be tailored to your own personal experience. But we see not only these sort of shared hallucinations, but we see a lot of people obtaining information that they otherwise would not have known in a lot of these altered states of consciousness.
And that's interesting about the mushrooms, and I'm going to skip over to ayahuasca. I recently was looking into it was art that random people had done over the centuries while experiencing an ayahuasca trip, and they had a commonality in all of them, and it was fascinating. And that's one of the things that they have these, they're very earth related. Everyone's trip is earth related, Mother Earth, the nurturing earth. um, and then I read where I think mushrooms and ayahuasca are factoring into some treatment for people like soldiers coming back from war with severe PTSD, and they're having a lot of success. I think with the micro dosing, I don't think it's wild trips to the Amazon, but it's all very fascinating to me that something natural can solve these issues and answer questions that we might have.
Yeah. So it's interesting. Some of it's anecdotal, but I've found other indicators that it's not. That they actually, because one of the associations with ayahuasca is the mother ayahuasca as a serpent. For anybody who doesn't know, somehow out of hundreds of thousands of plants in the Amazon, the different cultures in the Amazon were able to say, oh, look, there's this plant that contains DMT, and if we combine it with this one vine out of the hundreds of thousands of plants, this one vine, Banisteriopsis copy, we put it together, we boil it down, we can actually render dimethyltryptamine orally active. So normally you can't consume DMT, you have to smoke it. DMT is a natural endogenous chemical that we all have that can have these really trippy, basically it's a psychedelic that we all have inside our bodies, but you can't consume it from an outside source because you have MAO inhibitors in your stomach, but the vine gets rid of those, so you actually can have the trip, right? And it's associated with a lot of jungle imagery, like you said, Mother Ayahuasca as this giant serpent, a lot of jaguar imagery, a lot of the Yage shamans associated with jaguars. And there are some indications that they gave ayahuasca to Inuits, and they came back and reported these giant spotted cats, which is like, that's not the way hallucinations are supposed to work. It's not supposed to be in the chemical, right? It's supposed to be all from your own head. So but yeah, the psychedelic research is really encouraging in terms of the end of life therapy. And I mean, we think of even stuff not really psychedelic in the traditional sense, but MDMA, was designed for couples research. That was its original start. And there seems to be a lot of loosening and a lot of relaxing about the way that people think about these things and approach these things. A lot of these different chemicals and a lot of these different compounds for helping ease people into that transition of not fearing death. I have not done any of this myself. I want to and I don't want to at the same time. There's the legal angle, there's the angle of how stable am I to go in there and come back out in one piece.
My best friend says I would only do it if it was in an extreme controlled environment.
Yeah.
I'm like, let's go to the Amazon and do it. Let's find a tribe.
You look at Rick Strassman and some of those DMT studies that he did back in the 90s at the University of Arizona, and some people had some blood pressure issues, and that wasn't a university sanctioned controlled hospital environment. So I'm kind of like, I don't know if I want to go do that. But having said that, I think that's another thing that a lot of the UFO community ignores at their own peril is the altered state angle, because so much of the alien contact experience, not necessarily the lights in the sky, although you get some stuff associated with this too, but so much of the abduction experience sounds like the fairyland experience, sounds like the altered state experience, from missing time to the sort of things that you see, the images that you see, the feelings that you feel, they're all a lot the same. And a lot of this, I tend to speculate, and this is where I'm going with my latest book, that it's because this is all, dress rehearsal for what happens when we die, and it's probably why the terminal end of life care use is so powerful, because it gives people this reassurance that, oh no, this is just whatever this is that we're embedded in. There's something else out there, and there's something else to it, and that sort of that assertion that I'm making there is supported by the fact that the other way that you can get into these altered states of consciousness, there are a couple of different ways. Dreaming is the one that we all do. There are substances, but there's also meditation, and there are some disciplines, some Eastern disciplines, that actually are able to access the Bardo plane. They're basically able to induce near-death experiences through meditation. So
Well,
I think that's
you should appreciate this then. In the last year, I was the caregiver for my mother who was on hospice, and last May and June, she nearly passed away. So I went through her being on the verge of death, and then living with her for, I think, six more months. She died in January. But at the same time, I study shamanism. I work with a shaman. I know how to shamanic journey, and was journeying, I would say, last June, I was probably journeying every day for a month. I think I made a goal to do that. And this is using drum beats to get to the altered conscious state. And then when my mother did pass away, I was texting that morning with my friend who is the shaman that I learned from, and she journeyed for my mother. And so I was able to go through that end of life state with her. And I can tell you, it was surreal to be living with someone who was no longer conscious on this plane, that she was somewhere in between. And you cannot tell me, and I know people will say, oh, it was chemicals. No, it was, my mother was seeing all of our family members and conversing with them daily when she was at that stage where she nearly passed away. And then it all stopped. And she got better, she rebounded. She had been in that state for probably about 4 weeks, and then rebounded for 6 months. So I know it wasn't anything that she was taking. It wasn't any chemicals in her brain, because nothing changed except her reality. And it was, like I said, it was a surreal experience. I'd love to talk with you more about it. I'm not going to take away.
Why did you let me shaman explain to you? Like, that's awesome. You know exactly what I'm talking about. I should be listening to you. What am I doing? No, and what you said there about chemicals, I think, is really, really, really important, because we have an idea of that we have everything cataloged, and it's the exact same thing around the end of the 19th century. They had there were parents telling their children not to go into science because everything was sort of sorted and everything was said and done. We have this idea that we know how things work, but we really don't. I mean, I can explain to you about magnetism, and I can talk to you about the motion of the electric charge and the attractive and repulsive forces and all that stuff, but you keep on dialing down. Okay, well, why that? Okay, let's explain what electric charge. And you keep on going down and down and down until you get to the atomic level, and at some point you just throw up your hands and say, that's because that's the way reality works, that's the way it is. There's no final answer. It reminds me of the fact that I read this one time, that if you click on the first link in every Wikipedia article and you keep on clicking, you will eventually wind up at a philosophy. Because that's, the implication to me there is that, like, that's all that we really have, or we don't understand the world. All we have are means of understanding the world. All we have are models of understanding the world. And that's why, if you click on, let's use magnetism as an example. If you click on magnetism and the first, link is metal or something, you can click on metal and then click on the first link there, and you'll eventually get back to a philosophy, which I think is a really fascinating. It might just be the way that that Wikipedia functions, but I really think it's interesting that we get back to. Anybody wants to try this at home?
I was going to say, there's probably 5 people out there who are going to listen to this and then to try it. Probably know all 5 of them.
I'm sorry, I got sidetracked on Wikipedia. What were we saying?
Yeah, I actually am just sitting here doing with magnetism myself, and I wound my way back to mathematics, and now Greek language, ancient. You keep on going back farther.
Mathematics is definitely a philosophy.
Yeah, so I guess that's sort of what I'm getting at. It's like that. The fundamental way that the world works isn't that we know how the world works. It's our understanding is the fundamental. It's not the actual way that the world works itself. And, I think that your experience with you said it was your mother, right?
Yes.
Yeah, that's a beautiful experience, and that's something that I made an allusion to the fact that I'm a Christian. I think that's something that Christianity is sorely lacking, is that direct one-to-one experience that you get, from things like that. I know plenty of Christians who have had experiences of God, through prayer and whatnot, but there's something about that direct hands-on experience. I've sort of touched it a little bit myself with some of the synchronicities that I've had, and one little ghost hunting expedition that I went on, but like there's something about that firsthand knowledge that is really it's really confronting, I guess is the best word to say it. And it's like, no, this is actually the way that the world is, and everything else is the outlier. Like this is the big show right here.
Well, and let me I know I want to talk about your trip to Ireland, because this makes sense. I swear it'll come back around. One of the things that you did, and like I said, I watched your films, is you were talking about the feeling. And to me, I'm a feeling person. I get really deep feelings about places and things, and that I cannot explain. And there's no way to relate it to people until someone told me to do it through smell. So if I just like, well, I just have a feeling, people don't take it as serious as if I said something like it smells wrong. And I thought, I've got to ask Joshua about how it felt to be in Ireland in a fairy ring and what he was feeling. And so I'm going to ask you what it smelled like.
What it smelled like? Oh man, peat. It smells like a lot of peat.
Oh, I know that guy. He smells horrible.
But
sorry.
No, that's good. I wouldn't have put that together. No, I think that really, for me, nothing out of the ordinary, nothing really anomalous. Depending on where I was, it was, earthy, or if I was, next to the sea, as you often are on an island like Ireland. The smell of that as well. I will say that there's something that you don't get over here. I'm sure you do some places, but the places that I tend to go over here in America, I don't get a lot of feelings like this, and it's hard to put your finger on. It's not consistent from place to place, which I think is, some places you're like, oh, the magic's sort of been tapped out of here, and some places you go and you're like, oh no, this is either untouched, or it's been so strong that time hasn't diminished its potency or something. But and it's not, I mean, my wife felt it too, and I'm sure part of it is us spooking ourselves out or something, but it was really strange to me to go to a couple of different sites in the same day, and some sites to feel a lot more sinister than others. There was one, I think it was around Ballyfall, and I'm not sure, because we had looked all day for like this particular fairy fort that was supposed to be somewhere, and we couldn't find it. But the truth of the matter is that once you know what you're looking for, they're pretty easy to find, a lot of them. And this one was just in the middle of a field, and I hopped the electric fence and got a little zap, and but I was like, I'm gonna go see this thing. And I went up to it, and it's just, you can tell it's in the middle of the field. There's this sort of rough ring of, it used to be a rock wall around it. All the trees have grown up. And man, I could not have been paid to have walked into the center of that thing. And then, a couple days later, we were at a bunch of other different sites on the Dingle Peninsula, and there's nothing there. I don't know what is going on there, but it's just, there's nothing that even is comparable standing in the middle of some of those sites that I felt standing outside that other one that I went to. And I don't know what that is, but
did you go to any of the Standing Stone sites when you were
Yeah, so one of the days that we I don't think I really took any video of this, but one of the places that we made it a point to go to was Loch Gur, which is like one of the most continuously inhabited, or if not the oldest continuously inhabited spot in Ireland, if memory serves. Um, and this is also has the largest stone circle in Ireland as well, and that's a place that you could tell there's something really strange about it. There's a big the biggest stone there is called Crom Dubh, and if I'm mispronouncing my Irish, which I probably am, please forgive me. But it means like the sort of, as I recall, it means the dark one or something like that. And there was we had the fortunate we were fortunate enough to meet a local guide who had been recommended, and he was talking to us, and he said, if you put your head on the rock, you'll something will happen to you. I'm like, what does that even mean? But I did it twice, and once, in the day, and once we went back late at night, and it really was kind of strange, because I think he described it as like sort of feeling like, your forehead starts to get a little bit slippery and almost feels like things are getting permeable, between you and the rock. And I remember both times I got to the point where, that feeling where you're, like, when people talk about falling to sleep, not like falling to sleep, but like the falling sensation of like
Yeah.
sort of losing yourself. It was like after about like a minute and a half of doing it, I started to feel that. And both times I jerked back because I was like, what the heck is that? I don't know if that's, psychosemantic. I totally am willing to entertain the idea that it was. But it was definitely something that I hadn't really experienced anywhere else, for sure.
I had a friend that was part of a Wiccan circle in Britain, and he had told me that like the old standing stones, not Stonehenge, he says he felt like Stonehenge was like a recreation of this, trying to achieve what the original ones were, but they're like gateways between the realms. But
I mean, yeah, I think that I mean, so it's a common recurring motif that you see. I mean, especially across Europe, especially across Western Europe, but kind of everywhere, that anytime there's a structure that was built by an older civilization, it becomes this sort of portal to the other world. And I think that I really do think that there is something to it. I think that it ties into like what your friend was looking at, sort of like the ideas of ley lines and these spirit roads and stuff. I think this is all, again, I know it's so kind of cheesy to say, but I think it really is all connected. And these stone circles, I mean, obviously they were used for some sort of ritual purpose. And I think just because I think some of these places are kind of just thirsty, I think that a lot of that, I think a lot of what happened there stopped a while back, and and people just don't give them as much love as they once got. Now, having said that,
that's
the circle
interesting.
at well, having said that, the circle at Loch Gur is still, it's sort of a site of, vague pilgrimage to people who are occultists and pagans and, Wiccans or whatever. And there is still, because of the certain alignments, there, the solstices are still celebrated there with people gathering, and it lines up somehow particularly. I can't recall off the top of my head, but yeah, I mean, these places, I think, are set up in specific areas, and the locations of which are very important. And I think it might be kind of similar to the sort of intersective points that you find in a lot of, acupuncture. I had acupuncture once, didn't do a lot for me, but I can understand how some of that Chinese medicine might have a beneficial effect for some people. And yeah, I think it's kind of the same. I think that just like we have some of these intersecting points that might be pressure points, if you want to get a little bit more, reductive or a little bit more Western with it, pressure points. And I think that the Earth has these pressure points too. Now the question is, on our pressure points, we get a full body change when we apply pressure to them or whatever. What happens what happens to the Earth's pressure points? I don't know.
Well,
But I think that, yeah.
I practiced Reiki, and I actually took Reiki from the same person that I'm learning shamanism from. And
see, I keep on talking over you. I'm sorry about that. You should be telling me this stuff.
well, I was gonna say that it has a lot to do with the energy of the two as well, because I can practice Reiki with Tracy, and it's just on fire energy between us. And then I can do it with someone who doesn't believe, and it's very faint. I mean, it's still there. The Reiki energy is still there because it's universal. But I think something to do with whether or not a person is receptive to it has a lot to do with the energy exchange as well. I know that doesn't make sense, but it's just my 2 cents.
No, it does. And I think this is one of the greatest disservices that we have done to ourselves is the way that we downplay the importance of mind over matter. And I know it sounds cheesy, and I totally get it, but if you've ever had a loved one in the hospital, or if you've ever had multiple loved ones in the hospital, some of which made it and some of which didn't, oftentimes there is a tangible decision, a tangible change between those who decide that they're done and those that don't. And I think that if that's the case, then it would be logical that whenever you're tapping into some of these alternative therapies, that belief does play a significant role. I mean, another good example is that people have found efficacy in praying their alien abductions away, right? They pray to Jesus and the alien goes away. But this works for Buddhists, and this works for atheists, and it's almost as if the act of intention, the act of belief itself, has some degree of power. And I think that's an interesting way to look at it.
Definitely.
I mean, and because every magical practice will tell you that intention and belief have extremely important roles to play. And and it really is, it is a magical universe, especially if you sort of adopt the sort of Crowley-esque idea that, if I want to pick up this cup, I'm turning thought into action, right? So I'm making my thoughts manifest. I'm picking up the cup. I've turned my thoughts into physical reality. It's a little bit abstract, but I think the point stands that, like, if you dial out the definition far enough, that even the most mundane things that we do are sort of an act of magic. They are making the intangible tangible. Similarly with inventions. People like to talk about how science gave us airplanes. Well, no, science helped put the airplanes together, but imagination's what gave you the airplane.
Yeah, birds.
yeah, exactly.
Birds aren't real.
Shay saying birds aren't real. Some of them have to be.
That's right. The tiny little drones, right?
Nope, but not since Kennedy. That's why he was assassinated, because he took the birds away.
Well, Joshua, on that note, can you? I'm going to let you go. I know that you are a busy man and you probably have a lot to do, but I hope you will come back and talk to us some more, because you're fascinating and I could just get lost talking to you all day.
Oh, absolutely. And we just scratched the surface here. So
I know we didn't really get into any of the things I had notes on. But I really could talk all day.
Well, here's the thing, and I want you to take this away. The bad shows are the ones where we get to everything that wants to be talked about. And those are the artificial shows. Those are the inflexible shows. Those are the shows when nobody's having a good time, right? So the ones where you don't get to anything are almost always the better shows. So take that away.
I love it. Now, I hope you will come back, especially when you're promoting your next book, because I'm sure it's going to be great and I want to read it. But
You say
in the
that. You say that.
meantime,
Don't say that you want to read it yet. You haven't seen how long it's going to be. So
I have time.
well, I went ahead and purchased 3 of your books. So, you know, I'm still diving through the Brimstone book, the Brimstone Deceit, which, by the way, you know, I've always told people that the reason I'm so interested in the paranormal is in case there was ever someone was possessed by a demon, I wouldn't know what to do.
yeah, I mean, it's kind of that thing about being, you know, if you're trapped in fairyland, what do you do? I mean, it's kind of silly, but if you wish you had that information, it's
Yeah,
the
someone
most
needs to
valuable
have
thing in the
it.
world. Yeah,
Someone needs
exactly.
to know.
You
All
give them
right.
your
Well,
real name.
now, can you tell
Yeah.
us where we can find you online? So, 'cause I know a number of people are going to want to deep dive into your books.
JoshuaCutchin.com. So it's JoshuaCutchin.com. You know, I used to apologize for it, but I'm just going to own it nowadays.
That makes it easy.
No, I was going to apologize for the fact that I don't really maintain my blog, but you know what? I'm usually just working on the next book, so I really don't have much of a taste for the short form stuff. But there are a couple blog posts up there, and you can definitely stay abreast of what I'm doing. Find links to all my books and links to every interview that I've done. So if you really want to punish yourself and listen to me nonstop, that's the way to do it.
It's not punishment, and I want you to know I've shared that with our Weird Realities group. I've shared it with Shay. I've shared it with a number of people, and I've been listening myself. And it's just so much really, really good material. It's great.
Oh,
I
that's
love
awesome.
it.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Well, thanks so much, y'all. I really appreciate it. This was a lot of fun.
Well, definitely. Like I said, you'll have to stay in touch and definitely come back.
Yeah, absolutely. We won't be strangers.
Well, Joshua, it was really nice to meet you. I enjoyed myself thoroughly.
Likewise, I'm sorry that we didn't get to as much stuff. We just sort of went off in 1,000 different directions. But like I said, I genuinely mean that. You know, it's the ones where it's like coast to coast when you have to send in your questions, and they're like just going through checking things off of a list. So yeah, this is a lot better than that. Just to be able to talk and honestly, and I mean this. I sincerely mean this. People who can just talk, you know, people who can just have a conversation and can hang, honestly, is what it comes down to. You know? So y'all fit in that category. You can hang.
Well, thanks,
Excellent.
Joshua. That means a lot.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, Shay, well, I think that's going to wrap it up for us. If you want to do our out.
Oh no. All right. Well, I guess that'll do it, guys. Weird Realities has some great programming coming up, so be sure to like, follow, subscribe, and set your notifications to alert you when we upload new content. And if you haven't saved the date for May 22nd, you aren't going to want to miss the panel for the zombie apocalypse experts we have formed to review and discuss the new Army of the Dead movie dropping on Netflix May 21st. This YouTube live event will feature best-selling zombie fiction authors Alan Gamboa, David Simpson, Jamie Hernandez, Jeff Thompson, Stephen Kinney, and W.J. Lundy. Until next time. That's going to do it, guys. Weird Realities has some great programming coming up, so be sure to like, follow, subscribe, and set your notifications to alert you when we upload new content. Until next time, you can find me on Twitter at Shay_Tully, and you can find Hadley at all the usual places at Hadley Thorne. And you can stay up to date to all of our stuff via Linktree/Weird Realities. Till next time, stay weird.